Welcome to Testing, 1, 2, 3, a podcast brought to you by TestGenius.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Jenny Arnez. I'm from TestGenius, and we're so glad you tuned in today, or perhaps you're listening. And today we have Mike Callen with us. He's the VP of Products from TestGenius. We also have Dr. Clinton Kelly from ioPredict. Clinton, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'd be happy to tell you a little bit about me. I have a background in industrial and organizational psychology. And so, for those who aren't aware of that, I do not work with the depressed people at work. That's the question I most often get from those who don't do this. I think I'm a counselor for people in the workforce. But no, I actually help companies decide who to hire and who to promote within organizations. So, industrial organizational psychologists, we focus on improving organizations, making things more efficient. I specifically focus on hiring within organizations. And that's what I've spent the almost last 20 years of my career doing, is making tests for organizations, whether those be personality tests, cognitive ability tests, multiple physical ability, interview questions. And so that's what I do, is for all sorts of different types of jobs and different types of organizations, I help them make tests to decide who to hire.
Excellent. Mike, why don't you say a couple of words, let people know who you are as well?
Sure. I'm Mike Callen. I'm the VP of Products at Biddle Consulting Group. Our product is TestGenius. It's a suite, a hiring suite, which is a testing platform, and it contains a series of off-the-shelf office skills testing, as well as a program called Critical, which is for police, fire, EMS, 911, and utility dispatchers, call takers, those kinds of products. And then we have a item banking testing platform system, which ioPredict, Clinton's company, actually uses for some test administration. And I would add that Clinton and his partner Jason at ioPredict worked with us for several years here at Biddle Consulting Group and continue to work with us here at Biddle Consulting Group. Yet they have gone on and launched their own company, and we're collaborating quite a bit as we continue forward in our own direction.
It's been a great collaboration. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. So today we are going to focus on personality testing. And so I have to tell you, when I think of personality testing, because I'm not trained in industrial organizational psychology, I'm new to this field. Honestly, it wasn't until I joined Biddle Consulting Group that I even knew that a job like yours existed. So I'm new. When I think of personality testing, if I were to go on to Google and in fact, I did that this morning. I typed in personality testing, things like DISC profile and Enneagram and Myers-Briggs showed up. How does that type of personality testing connect to the type of personality testing that one might do in the workplace, that they want to use a personality test to hire or to select the best person for the job?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there are some similarities, but there are important differences between those. They are trying to measure traits or preferences of individuals, some personality components. However, tests like the Myers-Briggs, for example, it was not developed with the purpose of making hiring decisions. In fact, the creators of the Myers-Briggs, they specifically say on their website, our test is not designed to be used to help hire individuals. It's not designed to predict performance in a job. It's more designed to give feedback for the individuals, maybe preferences of careers they may enjoy, but it's not designed to be used in an employment context. And neither is like the DISC or StrengthsFinder. Some of those, they weren't designed with employee prediction, with hiring in mind.
Okay. All right. It's interesting because one of my daughters recently applied for a job, and they asked in the online application, what's your StrengthsFinder's profile? What Enneagram are you?
Yeah.
So anyway, that's
and people still, actually this morning, I Googled Myers-Briggs selection and I found a number of websites explaining how to use the Myers-Briggs within selection. So people use it, but like I said, Myers-Briggs themselves says don't use it for selection, but people do it anyway.
That's very interesting, isn't it? We're really focused on doing things the right way, following the uniform guidelines, And it seems like there's a lot of mavericks out in the selection world. At any rate, it's just very interesting.
Yeah.
I'm actually surprised. I didn't realize that there were people that were asking for this kind of a profile. I would imagine that in terms of defensibility, that's a tough one to defend, right? If somebody says, "What's your disk profile?" or something like that, you don't
It
get
can,
hired.
it
If I
can,
didn't get hired, I
yeah.
might challenge that.
Yeah, it can be problematic, like I said, because when we talk about tests and validity is a misunderstood topic. Often those tests are not valid for that intended purpose and for the purpose of selection. And so, yeah, you can definitely have some problems if it were challenged.
Okay, so a couple questions come to mind. One, Mike, you mentioned uniform guidelines. For those who are watching or listening to this and have no idea what the uniform guidelines are, can you guys give a definition?
Yeah, Clinton, go ahead. It's your space, so
Okay.
I would get close, but I think you give it the best run.
Okay, yeah, no, sure, be happy to. So the uniform guidelines they were created in the late 1970s, so they've been around for a while, and they are the uniform guidelines on employee selection procedures. And they lay out like it says, the guidelines or the requirements if you're going to use tests in a hiring situation on what you need to do to demonstrate that those tests are valid for use in that specific situation. And the uniform guidelines, when we use the term test, it's very broad. It's not test in the traditional sense maybe most people think of, the multiple choice test. Anytime you are reducing your applicant pool, so if two people apply to the job and we say yes to one person and no to another, whatever we did to make that decision, that was a test. An interview is a test, a personality test is a test. If you're doing resume screens and you make a pile of yes and a pile of no, whatever the criteria you use to make that decision, it is a test under the uniform guidelines. And so the uniform guidelines lay out guidelines that say whenever you're going to reduce your number of job applicants to make a hiring decision, there are certain requirements that you need to comply with. If you don't, you could have problems legally.
And that goes back even to your job posting and your choice of where you put your job posting, right? You put your job posting in a spot where you're not going to get a diverse applicant pool. You have essentially limited your selectability in that case. If you put
Yeah.
invalid criteria in there, in other words, if you're posting a job and it says a driver's license is required, but a driver's license isn't really required for that job, you have reduced your population there as well. And so there's a lot of things in our arena that go well beyond the traditional written multiple choice type of test or work sample test or personality test.
Yeah, great points.
And I think another thing that's important to bring up is that I was taught early on that it's not just hiring that is selection. It's hiring, it's promotion, it's training opportunities that may be available to some and not available to others. Like in a union environment, if you're going to go up to a journeyman level from, I forgot what the basic term is, but those are all selection, right?
Yeah, you're getting put into what we call maybe a high potential group. Sometimes organizations will identify high potentials that are then put on like a track for a management track that inherently comes with potential increased earnings, other things that are that tie into selection. So whatever you're using to identify like high potential positions, those could also fall under the uniform guidelines requirements.
Interesting. That's great. Thank you.
So, is there a separate definition for personality tests that's specific for what you do?
Mm-hmm. Not so much a definition, I would say more that intended use. Personality tests for selection, they are built and designed for use in selection. So that is their intended purpose. The way I like to compare it is just like a test in general. Let's say I have an accounting test used to hire accountants. And it's a great test to hire accountants. It is valid to hire accountants. And now let's say I give that test to help me decide who I should pick in my MBA draft, in my MBA lottery, who I should pick for my next, and I give my MBA draft prospects this accounting test. You'd probably say, what are you doing? That test is not valid. It's not that it's not a valid test. It's valid for helping me hire accountants. It's not valid to help me hire MBA players. And so that's similar to like these different types of personality tests. It's not that they're not valid like Myers-Briggs. It's just not valid to use in a hiring situation.
For that
And so we
purpose.
just need to, or for that purpose.
So you've used that word valid a few times now. Do you want to give a definition of what that actually means?
Yeah, and so validity, there are different what we call types of validity or evidences of validity. And what the most common one for personality is criterion, what we call criterion validity. To not go into lots of different types of validity, because I don't think this is the purpose of today's conversation, we'll briefly cover a personality test under the uniform guidelines. It requires criterion related validation. So if you are using a personality test for selection, there should be some evidence of criterion related validation. And if we pull up, I can pull up a slide here, we can show a few here. Criterion validity, what that is a mathematical relationship between how people score on the test and some measure of job performance. So for example, if we say, hey, higher scores on the test, they're more likely to sell more of the product if it's a sales position. So if we say higher scores on the test, they make more sales. That would be, if we can mathematically show the relationship between your score on the personality test and how much product you sell, that is criterion validation.
Okay.
And this is a mathematical relationship. To show this, kind of graph it out, you can see if we plot here on the x-axis, we have test scores that range, in this case, 0 to 100. And we have some sort of measure of performance on the side. We can graph this. You see this person has a test score of 22, a job performance of 31. Over here, test score of 85, job performance of 55. You can visually see the relationship amongst these dots. What criterion validity is, you're coming up with what we call a validity coefficient, which is essentially just a correlation coefficient in many cases that shows this linear relationship between how you score on the test and how you perform on the job. And so that's what we mean by validity for personalities. We can show that this is a valid predictor of success in the job.
So that validity coefficient would be like the strength of the validity, right?
Yes, the strength. And the higher that validity coefficient, if it's a traditional correlation coefficient, it's going to range from 0 to 1, with 1.0 being a perfect correlation, which that doesn't exist, but in theory,
Right.
you could get there. The higher that number, the stronger that relationship. Visually, what that would look like, a correlation of 1, every blue dot here would be perfectly on this red line. That would be a correlation of 1. So the tighter these blue dots are to this red line, the stronger that correlation coefficient. The more spread out they are around the line, the lower that value is going to be, the closer it's going to be to 0.
Perfect.
A correlation coefficient of 0 would essentially be saying, it doesn't matter how you score on the test. We have no idea how you score on this test, gives us no indication whatsoever of how you're going to perform on the job. That would be a correlation coefficient of 0.
Excellent.
And where does the criteria come from?
Yeah. And that is flexible. The uniform guidelines say they just need to be important criteria, and they mention some examples. Some could be supervisor ratings of performance. It could be sales in a sales job. It could be turnover. So we could correlate with turnover. Like, can we predict maybe who's less likely to turn over with this personality test? And so that is open, and it just needs to be what they call criteria that are important to the organization, to the job. So most typically it's going to be some sort of measure of performance. If it's sales, supervisor ratings, or turnover, those are the types of things that are very common to see.
And when you have a test like this, you can assemble this test, and then you can just start collecting all sorts of information and find out that a test correlates to some sort of aspect that isn't necessarily valid. It wasn't intended to select for that purpose. So can you talk a little bit about that philosophy of not just creating a test and throwing everything up against the wall to see what sticks versus having some intention when you design it? It's a little bit risky. We've gone through this step with you folks many times, and there's a great deal of risk when you go through and you put this together, because you could potentially go through and not find what you're looking for, and that doesn't open up the ability to find some other unrelated thing.
Yeah, no, you need to be intentional when you're designing these tests. We don't just, like you said, just throw a bunch of stuff against the wall and see what sticks. And so whenever we're designing a test, a personality test for a job, we want to be intentional, and we want to do what we call a job analysis, where we analyze what is done on the job. What are the requirements of the position? What are individuals spending their time doing? What are the most important parts, the most difficult parts? We're going to interview employees, talk with them. And so you need to do your research and be intentional with what you are doing. I'll share a slide here. Sorry, I'm going to skip forward. This is an example for one we put together for a factory worker. And this doesn't show everything. We did multiple interviews, and we even went on site and watched employees. But we took a look and we said, hey, there's some attributes we've noticed in our research, in our analysis of the job. The workers that appear to, in this case, stay on the job, here's some characteristics that we're seeing. These 8 things that they're self-confident, analytical, forthright, and etc. And it takes some time. So you need, like Mike, like you said, we need to be intentional and purposeful. So you're not just saying, let's just throw some stuff out there and see if we get lucky.
So when we've created personality tests, we've worked together to create personality tests. We have used a concurrent validation strategy. And I know that basically, I would say that from my perspective, the 2 basic ways to validate a personality test would be either a concurrent study or a predictive study. Why don't you talk a little bit about that and maybe what some advantages of either are?
Okay, yeah. So great. So those are the 2 types: the concurrent or predictive. Concurrent, what that is done typically with your existing employees. So if you are in a job and you have a few hundred employees already employed in this position, what we do is we develop the test, or take an existing test from some vendor. We administer it to your current employees, and then we correlate that with measures of job performance. So if you have existing measures of job performance, or we can create new measures of job performance. And so that is a concurrent one, is you take your existing employees, have them complete the test, and we correlate it with job performance. Predictive is where we start to give the test to job applicants. And often you'll not be scoring it. It's collecting data in the background. So people are applying for this job, and you're giving them this new test. The applicants don't know that it's not being used, but you're really not considering their score. And as you hire new individuals onto the job, you then at a later point in time correlate how they scored on the test with measures of job performance. And so both, you're trying to do the same thing, correlate test scores with job performance. The main difference is concurrent, existing employees; predictive, usually use it with job applicants, and at a later date you have to come back. So the advantage, you can probably, just from the way I'm describing it, the advantage of concurrent is it's typically faster. You can take your existing employees, you don't have to wait 6 months or a year to find how they panned out.
Yeah, and your population is much more under control as well, because obviously if you're doing a predictive study, you're going to be testing all these applicants, and you might not hire 75% of them. So you've actually collected data that you're not then going to be able to apply later. And then I guess one advantage of the predictive study is that you get the broadest range of people that in terms of knowledge, skill, ability, and personal characteristics. With the concurrent study, you have a little bit of range restriction. Is that not correct?
Yeah, well, currently you can get some range restriction because these individuals are current employees, and we assume they're performing at an adequate level, or else they would not be current employees, or they would not longer be employed there. So that can be a downside, is that range restriction is because their scores on your test, there's maybe not as much variability or differences in how they score. One of the upsides of a predictive study is you are getting, like you said, the range of responses, and you're getting that real life situation from the job applicants. They are really applying for a job, so you're mimicking what you intend the test to be used for. In a concurrent sample, when you're giving it to current employees, they already have the job, and so they may complete the test from a different frame of reference than your job applicants, and so that can be a potential downside of a concurrent. And so there are benefits and negatives to both approaches, but both are equally allowed under the uniform guidelines, and both have been shown from a research perspective to basically result in creating tests that are predictive of performance.
Excellent. Thank you.
So you're mentioning developing tests or validating tests that are used for employee selection. Are they ever used in a post-hire environment for perhaps employee development or training?
They can be, but similar. That's often what you'll see maybe with Myers-Briggs or DISC or StrengthsFinder, some of those. And so for the intended use, again, it comes back to that intended use. If it wasn't, depends on what the test was designed to be used for. Some tests have been designed to be used for multiple types of things, but there's just something to be aware of. What is your test designed to do? And sometimes I'll see this with clients who want to take a test, and not necessarily a personality test, but let's say a technical skills test, and they want to use it in a diagnostic way to diagnose where someone needs training or things like that. And I'm like, that test wasn't designed to do that. It gave you some initial information to make a hiring decision, but it really wasn't designed to diagnose and tell you here's their training needs. And so you just need to be aware of what your test can and can't do.
Yeah. There's a maxim in HR as well that says job performance trumps testing. One of the things that happens is when a person goes from applicant to candidate to employee is that you start to have these instances where job performance is being recorded. And so very often we have people who will ask us, oh, is it okay to give our employees these pre-employment tests, and then if they can't pass them any longer, to get rid of them? And generally speaking, that's a really dangerous area to tread into, because you have a much better job related measure of what's going on, which is their performance on the job at that point. So at any rate, it's just an aside.
That's a great point, and kind of shows in this. You can see that in this graph. Tests are by no means perfect. Like you said, job performance trumps test scores. Like in this line here, you can see some of these blue dots. They're not on the line. So in some cases, a person may outperform in what we predict. In some cases, a person may underperform what we predict.
And so just to be clear here, any one of these dots is the intersection between an individual's test score and their performance on the job. So that one that's in the middle top there above the word test score is somebody who scored approximately 50, but rated almost 60 on their performance measure, right?
And then, so in that case, they perform better than we thought they would on the job.
And then conversely, down below the line to the left of the 40, there's somebody who scored, is that right? Am I saying this right? No, yeah. They undertested and underperformed either way, right?
Yeah, but they were a lower test score, but even then, the performance was
lower than was anticipated.
Yeah.
Great. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for
taking
me out of that rabbit hole.
but tests are not perfect measures. But what I always say is they're better than the alternative, and so they are getting you. They are increasing your odds. And
Absolutely.
It's like when people sometimes will say, this person's just not a great test taker. I often will say, there's also sometimes someone's great grandma who smoked 40 cigarettes a day and lived till she was 97. But right. You probably would not say in general, the trend is if you smoke a lot, you're likely going to have some other health issues.
Based upon my grandma's experience,
yeah.
We're going to expect everybody who smokes several packs a day to live to 100. That's not the case. Another side of that's really important, at least I always try to bring this up when I have this conversation with people, is that the alternative is that a human being is making a selection based upon, in terms of the applicant, nothing. You have selected somebody who will be hired, and you have selected somebody who will not be hired for apparently no reason whatsoever, or no concrete reason. And so that's another reason why to have this decision-making process tied to something that's observable, that you can find patterns in, or if you can find that there's disparities, you can measure those things and see what exists and then remediate that situation.
Yes.
So cool. If an employer would like to begin using a personality assessment, how do they begin?
There's a couple different ways. You can reach out to vendors out there. There are two different approaches. There is what I would call the build a custom test from scratch approach, and there is the off the shelf approach. There are existing personality tests that are off the shelf, and then there is the, hey, we build it custom for this particular job approach. What you're looking for may depend on your situation in your organization. If you're a smaller organization, or it's a role in your organization where you don't have that many employees, Off the shelf is probably going to be the better route, where a vendor has spent the time to develop a test for that type of job. And because you just don't have to do a sort of study where you can show this mathematical relationship between test scores and job performance, that requires data. And if you only have 10 employees in a certain position or organization, you don't have the necessary data to demonstrate a relationship and have any confidence in that. And so in that situation, you're going to need to rely on an off-the-shelf test where they've done some of that research and can show how it predicts performance for that type of job. If you have a large organization, you may be in the spot where you say, let's custom develop this. If we have a few hundred employees in a position, you can do that. So those are the kind of the two approaches. And I'm sure I can get into like how, Jenny, do you want to get into how we do that once identified, maybe which one, the custom or the off the shelf?
Yeah, I think you should. Go for it.
Yeah. So then when you get to the customer or off the shelf, there are different types out there of tests. A lot of them, there's certain, when it comes to personalities, they're typically statements. When you take a personality test, you're often reading statements. And I'll show here a couple examples. This is an example we call a forced choice personality test, where you say, hey, I'm more likely to, and this is a silly example here, but eat a salad or eat a hamburger. And you have some points in the continuum. Sometimes you're just given two options. You just pick one or the other. At this point, you're given 4 choices. On other personality tests, you're just given a statement and you just say like true or false, or that's like me or not like me. For example, I enjoy team projects, and you would say true or false. Other times, it's probably one of the most common still is what we call a Likert type scale. It's that strongly disagree to strongly agree. Again, I enjoy team projects, or strongly disagree or somewhat disagree, or to the strongly agree. So personality tests generally are in that kind of flavor where you can see they have statements and you're making some sort of agreement or disagreement with that statement. And if you're looking to implement it, so you need to go, if you're going to the vendor route, go to the vendor and you should ask the vendor about what this test was designed for and its intended use, to make sure they built this for selection. And not only built it for selection, but they have validity for your job type, going back to that accountant and MBA player example, to make sure they're not giving you a test that was designed to select MBA players and you're trying to use it to hire accountants. Just what was this test? What validity evidence do they have for your job type?
So as well, Clinton, there are many, I may not be using the right word, but I would say standardized personality tests where the battery, like Hogan, for instance, they're going to ask the same 110 questions of every person, but over time, they're going to do small studies with certain job titles or certain groups of people in order to be able to take this standardized test and key it or score it in such a way that it meets with that particular population. On the other side of the coin, there can be a custom test which wouldn't necessarily have standardized questions. They might have questions that are written that have more face validity. They're more written directly towards this particular job title that you're using the test for. Is that not correct? And do you have any recommendations about that, or any positives, negatives about either of those scenarios?
Yeah, that is correct. There's a lot of tests out there that measure what we call the big 5 personality characteristics. And like you said, Mike, it's the same exact test for every position. The difference being where you need to fall on the characteristics. So let's say openness to experience. They may say on this job profile or job type, we found that people who are more likely to be successful are high in openness to experience. And another job type, people who are more likely to be successful are in the middle range on openness to experience, or the lower range. And so they're giving the same exact test, but there's a different constellation of profiles of where you fall in these big 5 personality characteristics that they're saying is indicative of success. And I don't know if there's really like the one is better than the other, but when you have a test that's custom designed for a specific position, the good thing about that is that it was, like I said, that it was custom tailored for that job type. And so again, the frame of reference, even the way the items were written from what I've seen just in my personal experience with work, I tend to see higher validity coefficients with those tests when they are well designed and put
Yeah.
together, higher validity coefficients than with the general tests that are just, hey, we then custom create a profile depending on your job type, but it's the same exact test for all jobs.
Yeah, I think another aspect that's very important, maybe particularly important now in this age of social media, is the applicant satisfaction part of it. When I was growing up and I had nothing to do with this particular career, I took a lot of tests or did interviews or did physical ability tests, those kinds of things. And so I've often reflected back on those processes and thought about which ones were very satisfying to me. They had the face validity, and face
Yeah.
validity is basically, how does it feel? Does it feel to the applicant like it would be something that they might encounter on the job? So it doesn't mean the test is valid or not. It just really has to do with my own impression of it. And I do remember going back through in my mind some of these experiences I had, and I was like, oh, that was not fair. That was a very unfair experience. And I think some of these personality tests where you're asking, would you rather be at a noisy party with loud music or walking by yourself on a beach? What does that have to do with being an ABC job? There's a
Yeah.
lot of things that don't feel really good about that. Whereas if you're asking it in context of the job, do you prefer an active work environment where your day goes by quickly versus a quiet environment where it's maybe a little less stressful, or those kinds of things? That has a lot better feel to it than the other.
That's a great point, that face validity, which for is not what we always say. It's not like a technical type of validity, but it is real in the sense that candidate perceptions of the experience matter. If candidates feel a positive experience, they're less likely to, for example, to challenge a test or complain about it. And that is one good thing of the custom developed tests too, is that they tend to have a little more face validity because the questions probably written with that job in mind. And so, yeah, that is one benefit. Another benefit of custom developed tests.
Perfect. Thank
Excellent.
you.
So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take a short break, and then we'll be right back with everyone in just a moment. And we'll be right back after a word from our sponsor.
Ready to revolutionize your HR strategies? Head over to TestGenius.com to discover our latest tools and solutions designed to streamline your hiring processes.
Welcome back, everybody. And just a reminder, we're with Dr. Clinton Kelly from ioPredict, and we're talking about personality testing. So when someone takes a personality test or a personality assessment, a score is spit out for that person, correct? Can you talk a little bit about personality test scoring?
Yeah, so when it comes to the scores, there are different scores that are done. And those, when we talk about those off the shelf tests that measure the big 5 personality characteristics, you'll often get a score in each of those big 5 personality, what we call subscales. You'll get like an openness to experience score, an extroversion score, a conscientiousness score, and then you'll often get an overall fit recommendation. And this is something that's on the screen. This is for a custom developed test that we worked on with Biddle and TestGenius, where you give like an overall recommendation. And you can see here on the screen here, in this case, we say, hey, people are highly recommended. They have a 77% chance of being successful on the job. And this was based on job performance data collected from actual individuals. You can see the numbers here, the number of individuals. And so what we give on the score, we usually give an overall recommendation score. Most tests you'll see like some sort of overall score, and then you'll see some sort of subscale scores. The overall score is typically what is going to be the driving factor in whatever decisions you are making or informing the decision. What you don't want to do, and is tempting for many people to do who are not super familiar with personality tests, is take subscale scores and let that drive your decision. Because the subscales are a sub-component. They are sub, like it says, they are sub to the overall score. So less data points from the test are driving subscale scores because it's just a portion of the overall test. And so it really should be that overall score or profile score you get from a personality test that should drive your recommendation. And those subscales can be informative pieces of information to then maybe dive into maybe in an interview or another step of the selection process. But don't let a subscale score. I've seen this happen where someone says their overall profile is like, we highly recommend them based on the overall profile, but they'll see a subscale score where they're fairly low on some subscale. So I don't know if we should hire this person. I'm like, no, don't let that drive the decision.
All right.
That's a really important point that you brought up about the subscale, is that you can use it to drive questions in the interview process. In fact, very often the reports, I know the reports that are in the test that we've created together, you've included those drill down questions, because that gives you a really great opportunity to find out, did the test potentially really nail this subscale, or did it maybe miss the subscale, or furthermore, is this weakness maybe something that the candidate is familiar with and has the ability to work around it, which can turn a weakness into a strength. So that is that always something that's included with personality tests for selection, or are we just lucky?
Yeah, not always. So yeah, they're not always included. So that is, yeah. So there are some where they just give you an overall score, and I've even seen some that just give you an overall score. There are even no sub scores. And then, but yeah, so it is nice when you get more information like that. There are a number of tests out there that will provide sub scores and even some additional information or potential prodding questions. But yeah, it is, like I said, it's great when you can have that additional information to prod into an interview. But like Mike had said, just don't let a subscale score drive your overall decision. It's like letting like one quarter of performance in a business drive your overall decision, and you don't look at the yearly profit and loss. You're like, no, over a year we made a lot of money, but quarter one it was slow, and now you say, hey, we got to close the company because things are horrible. No, don't let a
Right.
subscale score affect the overall score.
I want to tell a quick story because this was something that was so impactful. About 10 years or so ago, we created a testing process for nurses, and it included knowledge testing, video situational judgment testing, and personality testing. And one of our clients told us about an instance where they were reviewing the results with the applicant in real time. So they had tested and then they moved them on to an interview process. And the experience level of this applicant was very good. The knowledge was very good. The situational judgment was good. But there was this one subscale, which was hostility. And there was a red flag on the hostility scale. And the interviewer asked the first prodding question, hey, so tell me about a time. And it was some question that had to do with when they were in a stressful situation, how they didn't handle it. And then they asked the second prodding question, and then started to feel that this was exposing something, asked the third prodding question, and at this point, the candidate slammed her hand down on the desk, said, I've been to anger management classes, I've worked through this, if you would just move on, I would appreciate. There was a great instance where, hey, that this did bring up something that should have been discussed and was discussed. And herein is the real value in collecting that data and having an opportunity to talk about it. Because, boy, when you talk about dodging a bullet, that was an important one right there.
And that is a great example of how to use that. So in some cases, those subscale scores, you may find something, like you said, that's, yeah, this is a red flag. But more often than not, I'll see individuals without prodding, like I said, without doing those follow-up questions, take a subscale and automatically maybe disqualify someone because of a subscale score. And I'm like, I just would not recommend that.
Yeah. Good stuff.
Mm-hmm.
We talked a little bit about how you use it for selection. We do a lot of work in the 911 space, and I know we're going to do a follow-up podcast where we talk a little bit more about that. But there's fairly popular personality tests in that space that are content validated, which the Uniform Guideline specifically says don't content validate a personality test. You want to criterion validate it. So why don't you talk a little bit about the defensibility aspect? I think the stuff we've talked about up to this point is really the utility aspect of the validation. Here's why you go through this process so that it will do a good job of selecting. But why do you go through this process to make sure that if somebody an applicant or the DOL or the DOJ or the EEOC or some plaintiff's attorney has a problem with something that you did, how does this come into play, and how does this help somebody ease out of an uncomfortable defensibility situation?
Yeah, great question. When it comes to those situations, if you have a test that, for example, is just content validated, or you don't have the proper validation in place for a personality test to show that it's predictive of performance, if you end up passing, let's say your personality test ends up passing more males than females, or more females than males, or in one, or just more of one protected group over another, that's when the uniform guidelines kick into place. The uniform guidelines say, hey, if your test screens out a disproportionate amount of one protected group status, you need to show that your test is a valid test and that it's screening those people out because they can't do the job. And it's not screening them out just because they're female or they're Hispanic or whatever group that may be. And so if you are using a test that doesn't have the proper validation in place, and let's say you're screening out a disproportionate number of some protected group status, you will lose in court if you get sued.
Yeah, good point. That's good advice. It doesn't happen very often, but it does happen that a process gets questioned, and it can really financially impact an organization in terms of legal decisions that might go towards the plaintiff, but also it hurts their reputation in the space. You don't want to be that group that got sued because they did something incorrectly.
Yeah, so if you're a vendor out there and you're not doing your due diligence, yeah, it can really hurt your reputation. And that's what I tell with clients. I say, yeah, we can put out a test that doesn't have the proper kind of validity to back it up. I said, but I don't want to do that because that's gonna hurt my reputation as an individual in the field.
Yeah, yeah. And so you and I know, and a lot of people may or may not know, that when criterion validity is established elsewhere, the uniform guidelines in 7B does allow for validity to be transported from the environment in which it was established over to an employer's own specific environment. Why don't you talk a little bit about what that process is like and any recommendations that you have?
Yeah, and that is a really great strategy for jobs, especially where you just don't have the sample size to conduct these types of criterion validation studies in your own organization. And so the uniform guidelines allows, let's say, Mike, because we'll talk about this in a later one, but we've done a lot of work in the 911 space with personality testing. And a lot of 911 dispatching agencies, they just don't have hundreds of dispatchers. They have maybe a handful. There's a lot of smaller jurisdictions out there. So if they want to implement a personality test and say, hey, what profile or what type of personality is more likely to be successful in this job, they just logistically don't have the numbers to do such a study. And so what section 7B of the uniform guidelines allows says, hey, if a validation study for, let's say, 911 dispatchers on a personality test has been conducted with a specific test, you as a smaller group, you can adopt this test and not have to do your own criterion validation study. If you can show that your dispatchers, your 911 dispatchers, perform substantially the same major work behaviors as those 911 dispatchers where the study was originally conducted. So basically you have to show, hey, there's a match, there's overlap between my job where I want to use this test and the job where they used to initially develop and validate this test. And if you can show that the two jobs are substantially similar in the tasks and the work behaviors they perform, you can transport that validity under section 7B of the uniform guidelines, and that fulfills your validation requirements.
And my understanding is that when you're looking at these work behaviors that were covered under the initial study, that's the work behaviors that you're looking at in terms of transporting this validity. There may be some other work behaviors that weren't covered under that validation study that aren't really a part of this conversation, but in terms of being able to transport the validity from this original study and bringing it over to your environment, is it not those particular performance dimensions that were purported to be measured or in that original study by that test?
Yeah, so you,
Going
yes,
with?
you do want to look at those. So those original things that were measured in that test, are those work behaviors also important in your job? And that's the critical part, is just showing that overlap. And it is not super difficult to do. It is, as long as I say, as long as in the original study the vendor did their due diligence and how they showed what the work behaviors were in that original study. So if
Right.
they've done their homework, it's a very easy process. I have seen this in the past where a client that I was working with was wanting to use a test, and they had some criterion validation, but they weren't able to give me information on what the people in those jobs did or what exactly they did in that original study. And so we couldn't really transport the validity because they didn't do their homework on that initial study. And
Right.
so that's why it's important when you do that initial study, the vendor should have done a good, thorough, we call it job analysis, of analyzing the job, so you can make sure there's a match between where they did the study and your job where you want to implement the test.
That's a really great point, and we might want to toot our horns a little bit right here. But being a shop, both of our shops are shops that we lean very heavily on the uniform guidelines and the principles and the legislation and laws that have been put into place, so that we are doing things right to begin with, so that if somebody does determine that they'd like to transport that validity over to their environment, they're able to do that. But you do really want to do your research, or as much of the research as you can, to make sure that you are partnering up with an organization that has the same values and is doing things right to begin with. Otherwise, it's the garbage in, garbage out philosophy, right? If you
Yeah.
start and you
Uh-huh.
transport over a validation study that's a bad validation study, then you're protected by nothing, right?
Yeah. And so that's one thing, if you're looking to implement a study, is ask that vendor to say, hey, do you have a validation study? They should have a technical report. If you're asking a vendor who's got a personality test and you ask questions about validation, or do you have a technical report that documents things, and they start to kind of hem haw or dodge you, or they send you like a one page, more like a marketing flyer, those would be red flags, in my opinion, to say this
Right.
person may not have done their homework. You should be hearing things like uniform guidelines, like criterion validation. There's certain terms, keywords that the vendor should be mentioning.
Very good. We've mentioned uniform guidelines a lot of times. We actually have a website set up that's uniformguidelines.com, where the uniform guidelines are in there topically by heading, hyperlinked. There's also the questions and answers to the uniform guidelines, which came, what, 10 or 20 years later, right? Or I don't
Yeah,
remember
yeah.
how many years.
Can't remember when.
But
Yeah,
but that was, they circled back through and said, okay, we've got this document. Looking back now upon it, what are different scenarios that have been encountered and how did this get interpreted? So both the uniform guidelines and the questions and answers are very valuable in terms of knowing what the best practices are for testing and selection. So uniformguidelines.com, you can go there and you can take a look at it, bookmark it, and refer to it anytime that you'd like. It's a resource that we sponsor. Jenny, what else?
I actually think we're getting to a point where we're going to start to wind down.
Okay.
And just want to let everybody know this is part one, or session one with Dr. Kelly. And next time when we meet, we're going to be talking specifically about personality testing in our critical application.
Okay, which would be the dispatch realm.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
For 911
Excellent.
emergency dispatchers. So let me do this. Let me change the screen here, bring us all
Okay.
back. And as we wind down, Clinton, if someone wants to get in touch with you, how do they do that?
yeah. So you can reach out through our website at ioPredict.com, and there's a space there to reach out. And my email is just C Kelly. So my name, first initial, last name, C Kelly at ioPredict.com. You can also reach out to Mike over at TestGenius and Biddle. And like I said, we have a great relationship and we work together hand in hand on a lot of validation projects. And so those are some
Yeah.
ways to get in touch.
And you and Jason still are maintained at ckelly at biddle.com as well,
Yep.
where we work together very closely, and we continue to really value this relationship and want to continue to be able to collaborate together for many years to come. It's been really great. And I would, for one, would like to thank you for being on with us today. I think we maybe even went a little bit longer than we had targeted, but it's been really valuable hearing from your experience regarding this subject, which can be a little nebulous. It can be a little
Yeah.
scary to tiptoe into. So I've learned a lot, and thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you for having me.
It's
I
been
enjoyed it.
outstanding. Oh,
I'm
it's
glad.
been great. And we do have show notes that will show on the page where you see this video. We'll have links to ioPredict's website, to uniformguidelines.com, and other resources that were mentioned in this video. So thanks to everyone for listening and for watching.
Great, thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to Testing 123, brought to you by TestGenius and Biddle Consulting Group. Visit our website at testgenius.com for more information.